I have a terrible confession to make. In all my life of being a gamer, I've never actually played Mortal Kombat up until this summer. While I don't think that's some cardinal sin against gaming, like if I were to say, for example, I've never played Mario, Mortal Kombat is still a series that has been around for over 2 decades, and I find it strange that for whatever reason, I just never bothered with it. So I got Mortal Kombat X on Steam, absolutely fell in love with it, and decided it would be fun to do some research on the franchise's early troubles. After all, if Pokemon caused a moral panic over the travesty that is evolution to our feeble elders, you can imagine how horrified they were when Mortal Kombat strut its violent self into the faces of the simple-minded, impressionable youth that was you and I. And boy, when a game leads to actual congressional hearings, you know that you're in for some fascinating parts of gaming history. But more on that later. Let's start first with a bit of context on the state of gaming as it existed in a pre-Mortal Kombat world, if you will. Way back in 1976, a company by the name of Exidy released an arcade game by the name of Death Race, a game featuring vehicular combat. The point of the game, which supported up to 2 players, was to control your car to run over gremlins, of which would emit a screech when hit and would then turn into a tombstone. The players would then have to hunt down the remaining gremlins on screen, all while avoiding the tombstones of previously hit targets to increase their score. Simple enough. However, some people found that running over the humanoid enemies, as well as the sound they made when hit, to be offensive. News of the game spread, and most subsequent publications regarding Death Race were negative. I bring this up because this marks one of the first points in video gaming history that a game was viewed as controversial and or called into question as being overly violent. 12 years later, in 1988, Computer Gaming World issues their 43rd issue, which features an article titled Goodbye G Ratings, that discusses the general reception and reaction to the previous year's Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, the first in a series now spanning 3 decades. The author questions the social responsibility of game developers and whether or not it is up to them to censor the content of their games in order to keep unwanted material out of the reach of youth. He calls upon the executive director of the Software Publishers Association of America, who had the following to say. Adult computer software is nothing to worry about. It's not an issue that the government wants to spend any time with. They just got done with a big witch hunt in the music recording industry, and they got absolutely nowhere. Though he later states an advocacy for voluntary warning labels on games, I found this to be interesting in hindsight. Finally, with all the preliminary stuff out of the way, we reach October 8th, 1992, and Midway's Mortal Kombat has finally released to arcades across North America. However, it would seem that Midway would manage to avoid most of the controversy for about a year until September 13th, 1999, a day now dubbed Mortal Monday. This day marked the home release of Mortal Kombat to the SNES, Game Gear, Game Boy, and the Genesis, and was accompanied by a flurry of commercials and marked the day in which one of the most financially successful fighting game series to date launched. Then, another 3 months later, on December 9th, 1993, the aforementioned congressional hearing was called in to discuss video game violence, led by Senators Herb Kohl and Joe Lieberman. This was Senator Kohl's opening statement.
Today is the first day of Hanukkah, and we have already begun the Christmas season. It is a time that we think about peace on earth and goodwill towards all people, and also about giving gifts to our friends and our loved ones. But it is also a time when we need to take a close, hard look at just what it is that we are actually buying for our kids. And that is why we are holding this hearing on violent video games at this time. That is why we intend to introduce legislation on violent video games as soon as Congress returns. Senator Lieberman.
The hearing was called upon by the home releases of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. Footage of both games were shown in the hearing, and both senators expressed their disdain for both games, claiming they shouldn't have even been sold on the market at all. Even though the SNES version of the game contains no gore in contrast to its Genesis counterpart, Lieberman presses that the game is still overly violent. He also attacks the advertising of Mortal Kombat, which he claims a commercial featuring a violent child is still a commercial targeted at kids and is thus inappropriate. Here was the overall talking point of this hearing. Regulation of game content and censorship versus content labels and warnings. Representatives from both Nintendo and Sega were present to defend the ideals of freedom of expression and the implementation of content warnings. Following the hearing, Senator Lieberman proposed the Video Game Rating Act of 1994, of which its purpose states the following. The purpose of this act is to provide parents with information about the nature of video games which are used in homes or public areas, including arcades or family entertainment centers. Sounds an awful lot like the ESRB, right? The catch was, as stated in the bill, the video game industry would, following a one-year period in the enactment of the bill, would have that year to implement stronger and universal content warnings for every game to warn of their violent or sexual content. This would have to be an industry-wide standard that would be used by all game publishers. If they failed to do so within the year, the president would appoint a 5-member council to implement game ratings for them. However, here's the thing. Despite the heated discussions in the congressional hearing with the odds seemingly against the gaming industry, Lieberman's bill died in Congress and was never enacted. But this didn't stop game companies from worrying about more government interference in the industry, and so they set out to develop a system for game ratings regardless, under the newly formed Interactive Digital Software Association. And so it came to be that on July 29, 1994, the IDSA announced the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or as we more commonly know it as the ESRB. So there you have it, a more in-depth look at the creation of the ESRB and how Mortal Kombat is to thank for it. However, as mentioned before, Mortal Kombat has been around for a long time now, and the ESRB was just the beginning. As the years went by, Mortal Kombat continued to come under fire. This took form in a number of ways, such as game bans in various countries such as Australia and Germany, being blamed for a number of murder cases, call-outs on violent advertising, Jack Thompson, featuring in a number of studies regarding video game violence, and so on. And yet that doesn't stop Mortal Kombat in the slightest. Despite the long train of issues dating all the way back to its launch all those years ago, the series is still going strong. Mortal Kombat 2011 was the best-selling game of the franchise, while its latest release, Mortal Kombat X, being the fastest-selling. And as of 2015, the series is reported to have sold 35 million copies, putting it just ahead of popular series like Fallout and The Witcher, but just behind the likes of Kirby and Diablo. Since its inception, Mortal Kombat has spawned over 20 games, 2 theatrically released films, a TV show, and even a short-lived cartoon. Though Mortal Kombat is a long ways away from its heyday, I find it to be a really good example of perseverance in gaming. It pushed through the odds, and unlike a lot of other series roughly the same age, it is still doing fairly well. It might not be up to the financial successes of its fighting game rival Street Fighter, but it still manages to hold its own despite the seemingly overwhelming odds against it. You go, Mortal Kombat. I look forward to seeing what game comes next. And with that, thanks for listening to my long and hopefully cohesive rant on a game I enjoy, and I'll see you all in the next video.